So, today I want to talk about fascism. Fascism is actually a subject that's hard to define in any sort of words because it's an amorphous, contradictory set of ideas in and of themselves. But the general idea of what makes fascism and what to look out for is a far right, very conservative, very authoritarian, very ultra nationalistic society that is forming itself around the cult of personality of a single leader. The other thing that needs to be taken into account is that fascism will always have enemies. They will almost universally be opposed to concepts like liberalism, democracy, Marxism, anarchism, and any sort of society that wants to break down any of the hierarchies that they want to impose. And I want to talk about this more because while this is a great outline, it doesn't really drive home the point of what is so insidious about the contradictions within it. And so to talk about all that, I want to look at Umberto Eco's 14 points of fascism and kind of explain what they are and try to give examples when I can. So Umberto Eco wrote this in June of 1995 and published it in the New York Review. And so the 14 points of what makes a fascist society fascist are as followed. Number one, a society that is fascist, which he calls Urfascism, is a cult of tradition. Think about traditional and conservative ways of thinking, but made in a very hyper and syncretistic way. And what I mean by this is you take a lot of different conservative ideas. Think in the United States, for example, the idea that the Declaration of Independence is the great document of Western thought. Mix that with capitalism, mix that with modern capitalism, mix that with Christianity, and mix that with the myth of the US being a white nation. And you get these four different, very conservative ideas that, when merged together, create a lot of contradictory points and inaccuracies. We know, for example, that in Christianity, you're supposed to speak up for the weak and the poor. However, in capitalism, the poor are seen as having morally failed in some way, especially in modern, more meritocracy-based understandings of it. And so somehow these 2 points converge into one hyper cult of tradition in which all of these ideas are the truth. You have somehow made it so that the advancement of learning, the advancement of different understandings cannot come into play. And the Nazis would do this as well by mixing different occult elements and syncretistic portions of different cultures and identities. White nationalists often do this by mixing the cultures of the Nordic peoples with the Celtic peoples, with the Roman and Greek peoples, with the Germanic peoples. And even though historically these groups were opposed to each other, and they were enemies of each other, you merge all of them as finding some higher or greater truth. And by doing so, you create this cult that knows all of human knowledge. And so that is like one of the first things to look out for. And I also want to point out there that when looking at fascism, it can survive without maybe any one or two of these. But these are 14 things to be looking out for if you want to start labeling something as fascist. So number 2 is a rejection of modernism. And that doesn't specifically call to any sort of denial of technology, because technology should constantly be moving forward. The Nazis, for example, were constantly innovating in industrial achievements, but they spoke about how the modern values were somehow inferior to the old ways, and we needed to harken back to some great thing. If you want to take another example, in the modern day, think about the phrase MAGA, Make America Great Again. This phrase actively says that there's something wrong with modernity, that we need to harken back to the good old days, the good times, and make America great again. It speaks to that value. And I would argue in the United States that happens at the same time as a call for innovation. We are simultaneously asking companies like all of Elon Musk's work to constantly innovate and produce new technologies. We're constantly on the internet and advancing computers and technology and AI, while at the same time saying that there's something wrong with modernity in and of itself. So number 3 on this speaks to irrationalism, and that's done by taking action for the sake of action. This is literally the definition of reacting, as opposed to responding to something. If you are someone who does not take the time to think about what you are about to say or how you are supposed to respond to something, you are being a reactionary. Your position is to act first and deal with the consequences later. And this happens a lot of the time in manifestations of certain forms of, anti-intellectualism, where you get a group of people who, for whatever reason, criticize intellectual thinking as if it's some sort of emasculating thing, as if it somehow makes you less of a person for having to take the time to do that. It's the kind of person who would go out and just rush into something. And I wish I had a better, more specific example for that. But think about anybody who reacts to the thing they hear in the first moment, rather than taking the time to process it and think and respond. And it really creates this anti-intellectual culture that is designed to speak to going out, with guns first, with your, first instinct, rather than learning from what's going on around you. So number 4 is that disagreement with the culture is treason. So the idea of distinguishing things from each other, the idea that within science we have a way to disagree and improve knowledge, and you can have some sort of understanding and consensus that comes together through multiple perspectives unifying. And actually trying to work out contradictions and come to some sort of consensus in that way. In this particular case, disagreement is treason refers specifically to that cult of tradition. If you point out the fallacies within that cult of tradition, it often is met with anger, and that you are somehow violating the spirit of that cult of tradition. And that is not allowed, because any criticism of that tradition, say capitalism, is considered to be attacking the status quo and the normality of things, and therefore you are not American. If you've ever heard that anybody who's Marxist or socialist or anarchist is somehow not American, that's what we're calling here. It is the way to attack these specific ideologies of a person if they disagree with the cult of tradition. Number 5 is that it wants to fear difference. A fascist society will always call difference into question. This automatically makes the society, in some level, racist, sexist, homophobic, etc. You're going to want to find an other. You're going to have an in-group going up against the out-groups. You constantly want to be finding a way to find people different from you. So one of the calls to actions in the United States right now is always immigration is an issue. So Muslims are people that should be feared. People crossing the border, the Mexican border, should be feared. So anyone from Latin America. However, people that you identify with as similar are allowed in. You can create this in-group that pushes the boundaries of what is different, and you constantly define that and redefine it over time to create a group that is the other. And as long as you can define an other, you can define an enemy. The next point comes to an appeal to a frustrated middle class. This is number 6. And what this is speaking to is that people with relative wealth and status, maybe not the most wealthy people, are being told that they are under threat from the lower social groups. Think about the dynamic that's been going on with BLM and the white suburbs. You have a situation where you have one group of people who are very much frustrated and fearful of the idea that they could be displaced. The idea of we will not be replaced, or which is actually a phrase that has been used by the Nazis, the Jews will not replace us. You find that other group, you find that lower class group, you find something like the proletariat, the poor. And this could be along racial and ethnic lines, this could be along financial and class lines, but you speak to that frustration and you tell them how they are being humiliated, how they're losing their status. And the reason they're losing status is because of this particular reason. And by telling them that and asserting that, they become warriors of the state, of fascism. Essentially, you want to call out their fragility of their position and power, and instead of getting them to unify with the lower classes against the wealthy, they will unify with the wealthy against the poor to keep them in their place. Number 7 is an obsession with a plot. And this speaks to a lot of the things that we've been talking about already. For example, think about in Nazi Germany. You had this appeal to xenophobia, that the Jewish conspiracy, the Jewish people were coming out and trying to constantly take over and cause harm, and you attack them. And think about in the United States when you have this constant obsession with China is going to destroy American democracy. We can't negotiate well with them. They're constantly plotting against us. This constant need for an enemy plotting against you. That, and Antifa and BLM are constantly plotting to take down America and take down American tradition. When you hear these kind of phrases, and you speak in a very nationalistic, obsessive way about your enemies, and the plot that they have to take you down, you are clearly identifying a fascist trait. Number 8, followers must feel humiliated by the wealth and force of their enemies. So this is one of the weird components of fascism. The enemy is simultaneously strong and weak. You will almost always see that. And this is speaking to the strong side. The enemy, China, for example, will be this powerful nation that's rising and industrializing and out-negotiates us constantly. But somehow they aren't Americans, so they aren't strong enough. You find situations where, you have the left is funded by George Soros and has all this money and resources and wealth, and they can constantly take us out, and they're so powerful, and we need to stand against this mighty power of the wealth. We need to react against them. We need to take action. But at the end of the day, they don't really have wealth, and the George Soros thing is kind of just a myth. And then you have things like cancel culture, where it's, oh, well, when they say nasty things about us on the internet, they are destroying us. They are making us censored. They are preventing us from having power to speak on our issues. But really, who has the power dynamic there? It's a constant need to make people feel humiliated by the strength of their enemies, who are often weaker than them, both in societal standing and position, and in their own imagined views. Number 9 speaks to the idea of permanent warfare. If you are a pacifist, if you do not want to enter into conflict, and this is not the same as calling out conflict. This is not the same as the bystander effect. This is not the same as watching the perpetration of active violence and not doing anything. This is an idea that by absolutely being neutral, in an actually neutral situation, you are with the enemy because you have not enacted the lifestyle of permanent warfare. There is constantly a need to defeat the enemy. The enemy needs to be destroyed or defeated or pushed back. And the inherent contradiction in this is that every one of the leaders of a fascist nation will constantly speak to the fact that we need to defeat the foe and then we will have peace. We need to reach the final solution. We need to come to some understanding that speaks out against all of the ills of society. And the contradiction is that at the end of that, there should theoretically be peace. But there never is peace. There's just more conflict. There's just another outgroup being added. You know, the US, for example, had all of the Red Scare and the fear of the Soviet Union, and now we've transferred a lot of that fear onto China. We've transferred it onto the border with immigrants. There's always going to be another war to be fought, another enemy to strike down, another group to take out and kill and make the outgroup so that we can continue our constant war and conflict to seize all of society and make it under this fascist banner. And people buy into that. Number 10 is the other side of what I mentioned before. It's contempt for the weak. So the opponent is strong, but now the opponent is also weak. So it's a need specifically of a popular elitism. The people band together and give their power willingly to the leader, because the leader is the only way that all of the poor weak people can actually find themselves. We need to appeal to authority. We need to appeal to a hierarchy. If you want to understand the major component difference between left and right, it's whether or not power is meant to be concentrated horizontally or vertically. If it's meant to be concentrated vertically, it is probably a more right-wing system. If it's meant to be taken horizontally, it is probably a more left-leaning system. And of course, there's issues with that, and, you know, people will point out the dictatorship of the proletariat and all that. And yes, I still think there's a lot of issues with that. And that, I think, actually makes some of the more state capitalist societies a little more right-leaning than we typically place them. But there's a central position within elitism in the fascist society. It's not just hierarchy, it's a militaristic, aristocratic based elitism. The leader knows best. If you defy the leader, you've defied the state. If you've defied the state, you should be removed. And people need to appeal to the leader. Democracy is not what's good. Democracy allows the weak people to voice themselves. Think about the understanding that's going on right now with voter fraud. There's a contempt for an entire section of the population who believe that Biden won the election, because he did win the election, because leader knows best. Because Trump is speaking very strongly to this position. And this tends to go down from authority figure to authority figure to authority figure. The higher up the chain you are, the more people that you actually kind of despise. You have to bring yourself down the chain more and more and more in this mass acceptance of popular elitism. We accept as a people that this power is in place and inherent in a lot of cases. Number 11, everybody is educated to become a hero. And what this means is that by reacting, by coming to all the conclusions, we are drawn together and unified as everybody is a hero who is supposed to stand up and sacrifice themselves for the greater good. And what this means is it ended up turning into a cult of death. We will become heroes. We will stand up for our principles and we will speak out against the opponents. Not only will we speak out, but we will actively take a stand and charge. Think about the position of the Proud Boys. They are an organization that has risen up to stop the threat of Antifa and BLM. They are reacting towards these organizations. They are making themselves heard and in a strong position in order to sacrifice themselves. They don't care if they end up dying in that. They are the heroes saving the day in the story. And in fact, if one can get themselves killed in the situation, even greater, because you'll be a martyr to the state. And you saw this often in the teachings that went into like the Hitler Youth. Everybody is educated to become a hero. Everybody is educated to be the next great super soldier, to rise above and become one for one's country. Number 12. Since both permanent war and heroism are present, you will naturally have a sense of machismo. Basically, women and anybody who is considered non-standard sexual, sexually, is going to be a outcast. You hate women in this type of position, even if you are one. There's a internalized sexism at play. You want a society that is overtly masculine, that constantly prides itself on strength. Forget, anybody who's the outgroup. You don't want trans people. You don't want gay people. They are somehow considered weak. They are considered a problem. You want strong heterosexuality. You want a pure masculine strength. And outside of the realms of all of that, you will find them playing with weapons in a very sexualized way, as if the guns themselves and the weapons they play with are a manifestation of their sexual power and prowess. You will see them literally treating them as, especially guns, as a phallic exercise, as it's listed here. You want, if you are in that fascist masculinity and the traditional gender role system, you want women to conform to your standards. And so any deviation from that, whether it be something like the Me Too movement, or whether it be trans people existing, like I said before, or gay people existing, you want to squash all of that. And so that comes and manifests in a very, anti-SJW rhetoric, where the needs of othered groups in terms of sexuality are diminished and treated very poorly. Number 13 speaks to selective populism. And what this actually is, and I highlighted this because I think this is important for our particular narrative, that there will be in our future a TV or internet populism in which the emotional response of a selected group of citizens can be presented and accepted as the voice of the people. So basically, think social media. Think Twitter in particular and the way Trump has used it. Think about the very loud minority of people who speak out on Facebook, who speak out on Twitter, who speak out on a lot of these online sources. And because they've bubbled themselves, and because they appear so loud, they can equate the will of the people to this particular selective group. And this actually speaks back to the elitism from before. Where was that? The popular elitism. Because you can establish a selective populism. You can appeal and say that the idea of this particular group is the loudest voice in the room. So something like election fraud can be brought about as a legit term because people in these bubbles who see their own voice echoed back at them consistently can think that they are far more popular than they are and can speak out against democracy as being valid. They can call for things like the Supreme Court to overturn an election because they're actually defending democracy, because they're actually defending the true populism. And this is the kind of manipulative tactic that a leader under this would do, because again, the leader pretends to interpret the common will of this select populism by ignoring the will of the larger populist movement. And in that, you create a structure and system in which your voice is prioritized over that of others, and that other people exist and their lived experiences are then othered and perpetuates the cycle of everything else we've talked about. And this, again, like it says here, it ends up being manifested in a form of just finding parliamentary governments rotten. Basically, nothing moves quite the right way in a liberal democratic society, let alone any sort of leftist understanding. You start to be able to manipulate the idea of what democracy is and undermine democratic institutions. And while this parliamentary system would speak more to Europe and a lot of the nations there, in the US, we would speak to the Republican Constitution ideals and how they are being subverted in a very traditional way. And number 14 is actually the existence of Newspeak. And this is one that is designed to limit different understandings, specifically through removing vocabulary. A lot of conservatives that I've noted, and I might want to touch on this in another video in the future, a lot of conservatives I've noticed will refer to 1984 and George Orwell's views on these ideas of newspeak and doublethink as somehow representative of their views as right-wing conservatives. But newspeak specifically speaks to the idea that you're taking words out of the language. You are limiting the vocabulary of people because you're limiting their ability to criticize the government, to criticize the power structure. And by doing so, you make people have to be complacent because they don't have the language to speak out against it. And I know a lot of conservatives will make the argument, and reactionary types will make the argument, without thinking, that introduction of new gender pronouns and all these other things are somehow these reactionary things that are harming people and all this stuff. But they're not what we're talking about in this particular form. What we are describing is actually situations like what happened with Trump administration, where the CDC was actually denied and forbidden the use of terms like vulnerable, entitlement, diversity, transgender, fetus, evidence-based, and science-based in their language. You have the HHS, which was told to avoid using terms like entitlement, diversity, and vulnerable. They were forced to use the term Obamacare instead of ACA or Affordable Care Act, and to use exchanges instead of marketplaces to describe venues where people can purchase health insurance. By limiting and changing that type of systemic government power, it makes it harder to criticize the document. It makes it hard to understand what exactly the document is trying to say. That's what's being spoken about with Newspeak. It is literally the government coming down and enforcing language and limiting it. I would also argue that part of that is also an appeal to patriotic education that Trump made during his presidency. The idea that we're going to limit the narrative and focus of what is applied as American history to the American mythology, to the cult of tradition. And again, the thing that happens in all 14 of these points is that they overlap with each other. You get situations where one idea ends up representing multiple. The hatred of China as being a weak and strong enemy, while also being a fear of difference, while also being someone that we should take action against. And whenever action is taken, it's considered a good thing, whether or not it actually was good or not. The embargo, for example, that was put against China was praised as this great thing, but it actually took away money and jobs. Not embargo, I'm sorry, the tariff. The tariff that was placed on China was seen as this great conservative action of defending the borders of the United States, but it ended up hurting people. But we don't really hear that spoken about in the long run. You know, and this speaks also to a rejection of modernity, where at the same time that people are trying to appeal to, you know, a more modern, a more old school sensibility, but we have computers developing, but we're also in that rejection of modernity trying to speak back to the days where US had factories, but now all the jobs are in China and, you know, they're all in Mexico and the immigrants are taking jobs and all this other stuff. And the fear of new green technologies because we don't understand them. It's this weird, very contradictory set of ideas. But when you can define it, when you can try to draw enough examples to place it, you can call it what it is. And I think that's one of the most important components, is having the understanding, but by having a set of definitions as guidelines, maybe not absolutes, but guidelines that we can look at and say, does this fit the check boxes? Does this adhere to the type of society that would lead into fascism? I think that's really important, especially because I see people on the right especially, but I've seen some people on the left or center that don't understand the difference between some of the more authoritarian left-based regimes, or what are called authoritarian left-based regimes, and fascism. And it's very different, and so understanding fascism and what its function is and what its purpose is, and the fact that it is by definition conservative and traditional, and mixing all of these hatreds of an enemy and an outgroup together that are based usually along racial and ethnic lines and gendered lines. And also, one other thing that I didn't mention that I really should, when it speaks to weakness, it also means making fun of those who are not only poor, but those who are disabled or differently abled. You speak out against people who are not neurotypical. You speak out against people who can't walk. You speak out against people with certain disabilities because they are somehow disadvantaged. And you saw that a lot in Nazi Germany. So again, all of these things is this weird strength and weakness being mixed together. It's an obsession with plots. It's this idea that the enemy is wealthy and strong, but weak at the same time and under the boot of us. We can take them down because we are strong. We act. We don't sit and think. We aren't emasculated in that way. We're not like women. We don't do these things. We're going to be heroes. We are the true populist voice. We must band together. When you hear things like that, that's when you should start being suspicious. And it's not always going to be so explicit. It's codified. It's always codified. Because by the time you reach the point where it's not codified, they're already in power. They're already taking their stand. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. We have a great community, very anti-fascist. And with that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you learned something about what to look for with fascism, and I hope you enjoyed watching.